Welcome back to the Training Model YouTube channel. Again, I'm just rattling content on things that I find interesting and things that I learnt that really changed my understanding of human movement and programming and all of that sort of stuff. So today's conversation will be on intra-abdominal pressure, what it is, what it isn't, and how to maximize it. We're not really going to get into the practical use case of intra-abdominal pressure, like that's another video, but just so we can better understand what is actually happening to the anatomy and the changes in the body when we actually create intra-abdominal pressure and what it actually is. So yeah, if you have any questions, just drop them down below. Also, thank you to everybody that's already subscribed and asking good questions and chatting about things. If you do get lost in any of this content, that's okay. Some of these things will be very detailed. Some of these things will be very general. And as long as you keep tuning in, I'm sure that your pieces of the puzzle will continue to fit together. So keen to get started with today, but we're going to be chatting about intra-abdominal pressure. And to understand intra-abdominal pressure, I think we need to understand sort of the thoracic and the abdominal cavity of the thorax. So the thoracic cavity is above the level of the diaphragm, shown here. So the thoracic cavity holds our lungs and holds our heart. And obviously the pressure within that cavity will dictate whether or not air will come into the system and enter the lungs. When the space inside this cavity creates a pressure difference with atmospheric pressure, so pressure outside of the system, we are going to get an airflow move in one direction. Air and gas and liquid likes to move from high pressures towards low pressures in order to stabilize the system. So if atmospheric pressure is higher than it is inside the thoracic cavity and the pressure within the thoracic cavity, air will move from that higher pressure down into the lungs, and that's how we actually breathe in. And then to breathe out, we create a space that has higher pressure inside the thoracic cavity to push air out as it tries to escape to the lower atmospheric pressure. There is a sub pressure that lives within that, which is the actual pressure within the lungs, which is called intrapleural pressure, which is pressure actually within the lungs themselves. But I think we just end up getting in the weeds there. We actually just want to understand that above the level of the diaphragm, we have thoracic cavity, and that thoracic pressure and the amount of it will dictate whether or not air is coming in or out of the system. So that's what's happening above the level of the diaphragm. Below the level of the diaphragm, we have abdominal cavity and the abdominal cavity. And the base of this is the pelvis and the pelvic floor, which is also a diaphragm, which we will chat about at some point, but that would be called the pelvic diaphragm. But the abdominal cavity is below the level of the diaphragm, and it houses all of our sort of guts, intestine, stomach, liver, a whole bunch of organs, spleen, everything that's in there, plus a whole bunch of fluid, plus a whole bunch of space within that system below the level of the diaphragm. So that's the abdominal cavity that sits down below. And then obviously we have the diaphragm that sits between the thoracic and the abdominal cavity. And that diaphragm is the main driver or the main change in pressure between those two systems. And when the diaphragm descends down, we close space in the abdominal cavity and we increase space above it in the thoracic cavity. And then obviously when we breathe out and that diaphragm relaxes and ascends back up in towards the rib cage, we again get an inverse pressure change. So abdominal cavity gets larger, which means pressure is going to drop. So above the level of the diaphragm in that situation means that the thoracic cavity gets smaller and pressure increases, and that's what drives air out. So the diaphragm is obviously a big part of creating intra-abdominal pressure. It's not the only part. I'm not going to sit here and be like, you need to learn to breathe through the diaphragm and all of that. It's definitely part of it. But I think what goes a step further, and this is now coming into my movement model, is that the diaphragm, because it is a muscle, is just reactive to bone position and orientation. So if we can get our bones in the right place, it means that the diaphragm will more than likely contract and actually start to drive pressure pressure changes within the cavities. So if we can learn to get the bones in the right place, it means that the diaphragm will just do its job, and we don't have to think about it too much. And yeah, I don't want to get into that whole like dogmatic, like breathing with your diaphragm and all of that sort of stuff. There's things we can do, but it's not the end of the world. If we just get the system in the right place, we're going to get what we want within these two cavities. So when we actually discuss intra-abdominal pressure, obviously the use case, things like powerlifting and heavy strength training, it becomes very important. Learning to brace, learning to hold pressure. And the reason that is because if we can create pressure down low here, we can actually stiffen the system up, which is fantastic if we want to move a lot of force through the whole system. If we can have a stiffer system, it means that we're going to get better force transfer from the legs and the prime movers down low through the trunk up into the barbell, whether it's on your back or in your hands or whatever it might be. So intra-abdominal pressure plays a big part in heavy lifting, without a doubt, and it stiffens up the system. So how do we actually create intra-abdominal pressure, and what are we actually looking for from a use case when we're working with clients and when we're helping clients? So for us to increase pressure down below the level of the diaphragm, what we're trying to do is create a smaller space down here. And by nature of that, we're actually going to create a larger relative space above the level of the diaphragm. So for us to reduce the space down below, I like to think about this as a box or a room. So you're probably sitting in a room watching this or whatever. If this room was the abdominal cavity and above us is the diaphragm, the roof of that room, we have our walls on the outside of the room, and then we have the floor down below on the bottom side of the room. That floor is the diaphragm of the pelvis, which is the pelvic floor. Around the walls, we have all of our superficial muscles. The most common ones when we think about the abdominal region is all of the abs. So we have the rectus abdominis on the front side, we have the internal and external obliques on the sides, and then we have some back muscles and a spine on the back side. And ultimately what we're trying to do when we're trying to increase pressure is reduce the space. That's what needs to happen. And there's multiple ways that we can reduce the space. Number one, we can drop that diaphragm down and descend the diaphragm. That's more than likely going to be a breath-focused strategy where we're trying to get air in as the byproduct of changing the shapes of the two spaces within the entire trunk. So that's first strategy. Second strategy is we can bring the floor up and actually ascend the pelvic floor. And that's actually more than likely going to be a relaxation of the pelvic floor. It's not going to be a heavy squeezing of the pelvic floor. A heavy squeezing of the pelvic floor is actually going to create like a bearing down within the pelvis. So having relative motion of the pelvic floor is probably going to help us change the shape and reduce the shape or reduce the space, of the abdominal cavity. So that's two strategies. We can descend the diaphragm, we can ascend the pelvic floor, bring the floor up, bring the roof down, or we can squeeze the walls in. So that's going to be our ab contraction that sort of crushes in the system on the outside. A superficial, a very somatic bracing strategy with our abdominal muscles. So obliques, rectus abdominis, transverse abdominis, maybe some stuff on the backside, erectors and all of that. But ultimately we're trying to squeeze the walls in on this space so that we can increase the pressure down below the level of the diaphragm to actually create an increase in intra-abdominal pressure. Just going to take a quick break to let you know that you can use code YouTube to save 15% off all of my foundations courses and mentorships on the Training Model website. So again, code YouTube saves 15% off everything. My next mentorship kicks off on July the 3rd, which is a movement mentorship. So if you're enjoying these very particular, specific, detailed discussions on human movement and how to maximize certain things in today's video, intra-abdominal pressure, I can guarantee that you'll get a lot out of that mentorship. So again, code YouTube saves 15% off all of my foundations courses and mentorships on the Training Model website. I think a common misunderstanding with bracing, especially within heavy lifting, is that you have to maximize air intake and have to take a huge breath in order to get the diaphragm to drop down. And if we think about this from just like a process, we're not actually trying to get a maximal amount of air into the thoracic cavity up top. What we're trying to do is reduce the space down below the level of the diaphragm, which means getting a diaphragm to descend is more important than getting air into the system. And the reason is because we can get air into the system and change the thoracic cavity through a multitude of strategies. Number one, we can drop the floor in the same sense of it is a room above the level of the diaphragm. We can drop the floor to get air in. That creates a larger space, which drops the pressure, which gets air in. That is one strategy. Another strategy is we can actually just expand the ribs. So in the abdominal region, trying to increase pressure, we're trying to close the walls down. In the thoracic region, when we're trying to get air in, we can open the walls up and create a larger space to drop the pressure. What that looks like is, again, superficial muscles that pull on the ribs themselves, particularly the true ribs, so the ribs that attach into the sternum, so ribs 1 through 7. If we can get a relative expansion of those ribs, so this would be an external rotation of those ribs, this would be a pump handle action moving up, so we're increasing anterior to posterior space within the thoracic cavity. We can also get air in that because we've changed the shape, we've increased the volume of the thoracic cavity, which allows us to get air in. That is going to look like a bunch of our quote-unquote accessory breathing muscles, so things like your scalenes in the neck, your SCM in the neck, your pec minor on the front side of your ribs, potentially even like traps and levator scap as a secondary nature of elevating the scapula to create space for the ribs to move into. Any of those sort of quote-unquote accessory breathing muscles, I don't like that they're sometimes termed accessory breathing muscles. The reason is because they are breathing muscles. Any muscle that attaches to the rib cage can change the shape of the rib cage, which means they can contribute to both inhalation and exhalation strategies. They are just muscles that are dumb, and they will do some help if they're in a position to help, and they'll contract and create tension. That's all a muscle really will do, but it's a response to the task and the orientation of all the bones. So all of those quote-unquote accessory breathing muscles can lift and elevate the true ribs in order to change the shape to get air in. So that would look like the actual ceiling and walls starting to expand in that space in order to drop the pressure. I've got a little thing popping up here. How do I get rid of that? No idea what's going on there. So, it's not so much that we want to just maximize air in. We might actually start to see consequences of trying to maximize air in by seeing tension start to drive in other areas of the body. And that neck and that upper sort of thorax tension sometimes is a bad thing, especially when we're trying to lift. Imagine if we're trying to do like a low bar squat and we're trying to maximize this external rotation and this position of the bar low on our back. And then our inhalation or our bracing strategy is very much neck and upper musculature dominant strategies. We're just going to start to restrict our mobility because we're creating tension in that area of the body. So I think trying to minimize air in is probably going to be a better strategy. Yes, we need to get air in, and air in the system, we can compress it and create a more stable structure, but it's not so much that we want to maximize the amount of air. It's actually that we want to maximize the compression of the abdominal cavity. And that partly is diaphragm descension, which will bring air in, but it's not the only thing that is required to change that shape and compress that abdominal cavity to create intra-abdominal pressure. So maximizing air intake is probably not what we're looking for. We're actually looking to maximize our ability to get the diaphragm to descend. And the way in which we do that, and this would be probably another video at some point, is starting to learn how the action of the diaphragm occurs and how we actually can maximize leverage of the diaphragm in its descension path. Part of that is actually getting a good exhale so that the diaphragm moves up within the thoracic cavity, so that when we do ask for a small inhalation, we actually get a good descension of that diaphragm. So it's actually moving it along its continuum towards its quote unquote longest position, which is going to be up within the rib cage. The way we do that is we look at what a zone of apposition is and how we can maximize that descension on the other side of it. That exhale is also going to help us actually close and internally rotate the ribs and get some of that rib cage to move back down its continuum into its internally rotated or exhaled state. Again, by bringing the ribs down and dropping the pump handle and actually getting the bucket handle actions to occur down upon exhalation, it means that all of a sudden the diaphragm is up inside that thoracic cavity so that we can actually start to push it down in space. The good thing with another exhale-based strategy for bracing to set the position and to get the bones in the right place is that we're going to start to find abtension. We're also going to start to shift the center of mass backwards, which ticks a whole bunch of boxes. Again, we'll get into that at some point, but learning to actually shift center of mass back, get the ribs to internally rotate, get the diaphragm to ascend is going to be our best option or best strategy to get the bones in the right place in order to then, when we inhale and get a small amount of air in, we can actually compress that abdominal cavity to a large degree. And I just want to show you this continuum because this is my third major principle of my movement model, and that is that everything lives on a continuum. And there's multiple strategies to shift and transfer actions and movements across any continuum that we start to use as a lens to better understand human movement. And we're just going to look at this down here in this arrow. So at one end, we have thoracic pressure, and then at the other end, we have abdominal pressure. So if I'm trying to create thoracic pressure and drive this system to one end of the continuum, it means that I have to inevitably drop abdominal pressure in order to maximize shifting down to that end of the continuum. And in order to shift and push all of the pressure up into the thoracic cavity, it means that the abdominal cavity has now dropped its pressure. And we're going to see a response from all of the muscles and all of the bones and the system as a whole in order to achieve that task of driving pressure towards the thoracic cavity. And then at the other end of the continuum, we have our abdominal pressure. And if we're trying to drive force and pressure down into the abdominal region, it means that we're going to see an inverse side of that continuum. We're going to see the change in the thoracic cavity and a response from the muscles and the bones and all of the systemic changes that occur in order to drive pressure down to the other end. So if we can understand that we're just living on a continuum, there's multiple strategies to both increase and decrease thoracic and abdominal pressure, it means that we can actually begin to start to have a better coaching strategy and a better understanding of what we're cueing and how we're cueing it and the context-based drills that we're using in order to learn to shift and manage this internal pressure. Because ultimately, that is what we're trying to do when we're talking about intra-abdominal pressure. We're trying to learn to manage and shift internal pressure in these two areas, in these two boxes within the entire trunk. So I think a recap is that we have a thoracic and an abdominal cavity. And if we view these as separate boxes, and they're interrelated obviously, but in order to create pressure, we need to reduce the space. That is the most important thing. So it's not maximizing air in to get abdominal pressure, it's actually reducing the space of the abdominal cavity. Yes, air in is a byproduct of reducing the space down below because of the diaphragm descension, but it's not what we're looking to maximize. We're not trying to maximize air into the system. We're trying to maximize reduction of the space in the abdominal cavity. And there's multiple strategies that we can do with that. Air in is one strategy to descend the diaphragm. Compression of the ab wall is another strategy. Ascension of the pelvic floor is another strategy. And all of these things are a response to our global position and our global management as a system. And if we get everything right from a global perspective, the muscles will do what they're designed to do and maximize our intra-abdominal pressure as best they can for the task that we need it for. So that's going to be the end of today's video. As always, thanks for checking it out. If you have a question, please drop it down below. I would also recommend, if you're interested in these sort of conversations, please check out my movement mentorship. The next one starts on July the 3rd. So the intake is currently open. We have 13 coaches that are currently involved in that. You can use the code YouTube to save 15% on either the upfront or payment plan. It's a 6-week mentorship, and we're really going to dive deep into anatomy and movement and biomechanics and how to maximize this from a coaching perspective. So I think it will do... Honestly, I think it will be the best thing for you to answer a lot of your questions, especially if you're confused with a bunch of content creators and movement specialists and all of that sort of stuff. I really want to bring it down to the foundational principles of my model of movement, and I think it will answer a lot of your questions and application-based things when working with clients. So if you're interested in that, it's going to be one of the links down below. Also, drop me a comment, and please subscribe. I'd love to see you around. And yeah, I'll check you out. I'll check in again next week at some point with our next mini lecture, I guess, or just next thing that I'm interested in or helping people with better understand. So done.